So moving along, I am very happy to welcome back on screen with us Surya Vanka, who was just with us a couple of minutes ago moderating a previous session. So Surya is a transdisciplinary designer. He's a design leader. He's also the founder of his own design studio, Authentic Design, and he will be moderating our next session, which we are very excited about, exploring ageism in design. So I'll let the two of you take it away from here.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
And thank you again, Glen Hougan, for sharing this toolkit. I love how you ended your talk being the troublemaker in the team. We will try hard to be troublemakers in this next half hour, Glen and I. So just to set up the session, so in 300 BC, this is the time of classical Greece. The worldwide life expectancy was 28 years. People lived to be 28. So getting to your 30s would have made you a wise elder. By 1900, life expectancy had moved up to 32. And then by 1950, that life expectancy had gone up to 47. And today, in 2021, worldwide life expectancy is 73. So what's going on? We're living longer and longer. It's so interesting. This is World Industrial Design Day. So since industrial design first began in the Industrial Revolution in the mid-18th century, humans are living more than twice as long. Right? So some of this context has changed dramatically. And in the 21st century, we now face a demographic tsunami of global aging. We know that by 2050, 64 nations will have more than 30% of their folks over the population of 60. So this is really interesting. This is the context for what Glen is joining us today, which is, longevity. Longevity represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, right? But for billions of people, it also brings myriad challenges that accompany age. Loss of security, independence, fragility, all of that. And so in this session, Professor Glen Hougan will talk about his research and his work involving designing for an aging population and how ageism influences design approaches and product outcomes for this particular user group. Glen is an associate professor at NSCAD at University in Halifax, and he's a principal of WellSpan Research and Design, a design consultancy focusing on healthcare and design for an aging population. He spent over 10 years working on products and design supporting older adults and with a focus on designing to age with dignity, right? So you'll see his work has been featured a bunch of places, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, PBS. So we really have an expert here on aging. So thank you for being here, Glen. And I'll hand it over to you for a presentation, and then we'll hopefully have some time to have a conversation as well.
Well, hopefully that's sort of the plan. So I'm probably going to cover a little bit of territory, and then we'll have some time for talking, and it'll probably bring up more questions. When I wish I could say I'm an expert, I'm not a gerontologist at all. I'm just a designer like many of you trying to navigate this world. So I'm going to start to first share my screen. Can everybody see that?
We see it. You may want to go to full screen mode.
I will here, sorry. How's that?
Perfect.
And so it's a little bit about design and designers and ageism and a little bit of the journey I've taken over the last 10 to 15 years and some of the lessons I've learned. And I actually should have said lessons still learning. But I think this is probably the biggest one of the lessons, and I think it's so apropos for this conference, is ageism often intersects and interacts with other forms of stereotypes and prejudices and discrimination. So it's really connected with ableism, sexism, and racism. And all of these kind of connect in terms of health outcomes for certain groups of people as they get older. And that the health outcomes for our people that are dealing with a lot of the different, I'm going to call them isms, is a lot worse for those that don't. But I'm going to be specifically talking about ageism and aging. So I'm not going to get too much because they're kind of told a little bit about aging, but some of the interesting things is we are at a time in our history where we've never had this percentage of our population over a certain age and the numbers that we've had. And what's interesting is it's dramatically increasing every country's population. And in fact, it's increasing now more in the countries you wouldn't expect it to increase, and some of the developing nations, but it's increasing significantly in India and Brazil, and rapidly increasing in terms of the percentage of their population. So everybody's dealing with it. The other things I think we should also be aware of when we're talking about an aging population, the majority of over a certain age are women. And so they're dealing with a lot of those other issues that women have to deal with. And that plays into it just because they're living longer or living. And also the majority of the population are not in nursing homes. Vast majority, so don't think of them in nursing homes. People are navigating it at home, and the majority do not have Alzheimer's. So I think that's a disease that can happen as you get older. But again, I think we need to think of some of the cognitive decline and people get caught on Alzheimer's as a disease. Ageism is an interesting, and it can mean all ages, but I'm specifically talking about an older demographic here. But it could mean a younger demographics, but it has been kind of framed around, at least the narrative is around getting older. And Robert Butler first coined the term ageism in the 1969. And you can read it, but essentially it's around stereotypes about how we think about people. And this could be any prejudice you have, and prejudice of how you feel about people, and then how we act, that discriminatory, how we act. And some of it's in our interpersonal relationships with the group of people, or how we let things happen. But as designers, how we act is, of course, what we make and how we design. So those are some of the interesting things about ageism. Some important points that ageism starts young with some of the negative influences and goes right through your life. And you can be just as ageist as an older person as you are as a younger person. And ageism seems to cut across all cultures. And I think there's sometimes thinking that maybe some of the collectivist cultures might not be as ageist, but I think there's some interesting research finding ageism increases in those countries as industrialization happens too. So there's some interesting research about that. And don't conflate, you can still be ageist and still love your grandmother and have family responsibilities and looking after them. Doesn't mean you're not still ageist and sort of have some sort of ageist outside. So familial responsibility is quite different than ageism too. Also the idea that it is something that can be addressed just like anything. And it's also about some of that's the reflection we're doing. So a little bit about ageism. I think the one thing I like about it is this quote. It's an interesting dynamic because it's a prejudice against our future self. And unlike some of the other prejudices that we might have, of those other isms, this is something that we all in watching. I mean, I definitely won't experience gender prejudices or racial prejudices, but this is something that we're all in it together. And it is a weird one because it is a prejudice against our future self. And some of that is our fear of getting older, and we are living older. And I think as we talk to it, a lot of that fear is ending up alone in rooms like these, which again is not necessarily the case. Yeah. My story kind of started about 10, 15 years ago, and in the 90s, and some of these suits were being developed. I believe MIT has one. At that time, it was Loughborough and a few Europeans had it. It was a way to explore aging through making these suits. So it was something I did in my class. And as I was making them, I found that I was really just restricting movement. It was range of motion. That was all I was restricting. It was a very limited view of aging. And when I would do workshops, I would put people in them. And of course, if you just show a little restriction, it won't show anything. So I was exaggerating the restrictions and making them so they were hunched over and increasing what I did in this suit as sort of a tool to look at aging in kind of a functional kind of way. I was actually just reinforcing every stereotype you might have about aging. And the stereotypes we see them on signage, we see them on everything. It's this frailty narrative. And I believe that's what's happening is we're creating not just really designing for aging, we're designing for frailty. And our framework is frailty that we're doing, which is very ageist. Now, interestingly, I do believe these crossing signs in England were taken out because they were too ageist. But in design, you start to see that in terms of how we design. And I think that becomes one of our problems is that we have a frailty narrative and not about an aging narrative. Because in reality, when I did my aging suit, it was the person would be ended up hunched over in pain walking with their using my aging suit. And in the reality, I mean, the biggest lesson, of course, is such a diverse and individual process of how we age, how we all will age quite differently. And it's also a diverse group. And even here, you're kind of chunking them in 10 years here. And even that's too big, but it's quite a diverse group, someone who's 65 and someone who's 85. And I don't know if you recognize, these are all singers. And you've got Harry Belafonte, you've got Tina Turner, and I can't remember the woman's name from the Eurythmics, Annie Lennox, all coming from quite different backgrounds and also different singing styles. And I think we have to understand the learning that there's such a diverse things that we have, and it could be our health, it could be our gender, it could be our culture, creates this quite a diverse group. And in fact, this group is way more diverse than any other age group, if you want to look at that. And we tend to think of them as a monolithic, and I think that's a problem because there's a 30-year gap we're dealing with this here. Also, I think we mistake chronological age for felt age. So when we design for someone who's 75 and they feel that they're 55, we make that mistake. So we've got to be careful about that. And also the mistakes I kept on making is I didn't understand people's life course, where they were in their life, because your life course might be quite different in terms of what you're doing. Some of these people may be actually working. We don't know. I mean, sure, Harry Belafonte is probably very busy because he was quite activist when he was younger. I'm sure he's still an activist now. So again, there's quite a diversity in this group. The next thing I want to talk about is this ageism, and I think I'm seeing it. It's equivalent to elder speak in design. So you know that elder speak when people talk to people, it's like, oh, how are you, dearie? They find that we talk to, it's a little bit like baby speak when you talk to a baby. And it's this idea that stems the stereotype people they have a reduced cognitive ability. And apparently when you talk to people like they're an idiot, they will think they're an idiot. So again, that's their narrative about how we speak to them. And I think something's happening in design, and I'm going to call it elder design. And it's that exaggerated, just like elder speak, that exaggerated functional design we do. And that's really around healthcare and frailty products. Let's make the buttons huge so they can see it. And I think that's a bad narrative for them, because if we make stupid products, they will think that aging is stupid and they will think themselves stupid. So again, product semiotics says the narrative that we create for people has an influence on how they see themselves and also how we see them. And that's very important because that plays into our fear of aging. Oh my goodness, I don't want to end up with Velcro shoes. And we all know that sound of Velcro, right? Or all those other stereotypes about aging. It plays into our fears. And I will say, if you're ageist, they do find that if you're younger and you're ageist, you live less. You don't live as long because you don't have a healthy view of aging. So if you've got that prejudice and you're feeling that you're scared of getting older, you'll probably die younger. At least that's what the research is showing. I think there's 4 contributing factors. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly that I think is driving ageism. One is that the user focus, and I talked about this, is frailty. And this is a frailty, a scale I did with Dr. Ken Rockwood, who was a gerontologist, and it was looking at frailty. And these were some graphics I did. What we are mostly when we design is we're not doing the upper end of how you might look at that frailty. We're doing the lower end, the extreme end, because those are where sometimes designers think they need to intervene. And a lot of times it is where it's being intervened because it's driven by an industry focus around healthcare, medical, and caregiving. And you must understand that the healthcare industry and the medical industry, hospitals, they're finding that they are ageist, if not more ageist than the general population. Because remember who they're dealing with. A sick, frail, especially if it's an aging population, that's their main goods. That's not the reality of aging, but that's who they're dealing with. So you're getting them creating an ageist narrative around products that they're developing. And these products tend to be around monitoring. They tend to read about aids around your health and around facilities. And that becomes a specific product focus. And I found myself doing a lot of these products. The design focus then becomes around how do we make them functional? How do we control this population group? And so you get a lot of, and especially now you're finding, especially digital products, that are all around monitoring. How do we monitor this group to keep them safe? But really a lot of times it's around the institution in terms of control for them of that population in a healthcare environment. So the problem is, I think the design outcomes is a little bit ageist, is we're addressing health and caregiving medical sectors needing control of a frail population through the design of aids and monitoring programs, products, and spaces. And I think that's a problem. And I will say I'm guilty of it. Most of the people that approach me are dealing with these issues and the issues that I have, because there's a lot of design need, but it is a very select and small segment of the products this group is using, but it's this one that's getting the narrative about who they are. We do have certain guidelines. The problem with sometimes these guidelines is that they still default to functional issues and functionality. And also they're not being, some of them, the people that are taking them are not actually being able to address some of the biases that they have. And I think some other people have talked about how do we address biases, what do we bring into them. So there is some problems that they're not engaging a larger group of people, and they kind of default to functionality issues. I think if you look at, and here's an interesting thing I've done sometimes with my students, we look at these two products, which are both walkers. And we're looking at two groups, which always get conflated, you know, the baby talk, the agers, or the elders speak, baby speak. So here's two groups that sometimes get conflated in terms of how we treat them. But interesting, we have quite a different design message for one of them than the other. So when we talk about older people or an older group, we're talking about the user experience. When we talk maybe about designing for a younger group, it's about what condition, what's the human, where are they in their life course? The other one we talk about, let me just move this around. We talk about fit and about how it fits into a person life, where the other talks about functionality. Like we're always talking about how does this function? What's the functionality of this product as opposed, did this product fit? One we tend to focus, and I know we focus on their disability, the functionality, and one we focus on if it's younger, their ability. What can they do? And how do we enhance that? I will say that there's not a lot. They're finding that when we look at this segment, we look at through, there's a lot of idea of pity. It's not empathy. And we have to understand the difference between pity and empathy. And pity is not a good place to start from. One, we try to, there's protection, and one we want to offer security. One is dependence or independence, but sometimes it's dependence on our healthcare system. And the other one is a little bit interdependence. One is, oh, we're going to have some tech fixes that can help them, better wheelchair and things like that. The other group, we're still talking a little bit about social fixes. Oh, we need to read them more, we need to provide some education and things like that. So I think if you look at those, I'm thinking one side, if we look at those two groups, once the idea of designing for aging is not a very positive one, the other one around designing for dignity. And I think that's what we tend to do, is how do we create dignified products? To end off with, there is the global report on ageism that just went out, and they do have some interesting strategies. And I've talked about other strategies, but in this report, educational interventions. I think we've talked a lot about that. And when you were going through your education, or even when you've designed in your design firm, what have you talked about ageism, or any of the isms if you want to talk about it? But how have you talked about it? Have you talked about it? Have you been educated on it? And I think design education needs to do a much better job. Interesting, ageism is very rarely addressed. And it's kind of this unseen prejudice that doesn't really get highlighted as much. Intergenerational contact. I would ask when we talk about diversity in your design firm, when you're sitting around the table, is there designers that are over a certain age? So we talk about diversity and other things. I think there needs to be some age diversity. And we do find when you do that, that when you have more of an intergenerational connection, it becomes very positive. So to end off, the World Health Organization actually talks about a recommendation to reduce ageism, and it's by to build a movement to change the narrative around age and aging. And I think designers have the opportunity to design a movement around changing the design narrative of the products they use. And here's Carl Fredericks from the movie Up. Look at the narrative the designer took to design about this, and the ageist stereotypes, the bow tie, the high pants, the tweed shirt. I don't notice anybody, at least around Halifax, Nova Scotia, wearing this. And also the balls on the, to make the things slide easier. Where else do you find tennis balls on things? Kids' furniture. You know, so there's some interesting dynamics there. The narrative, this was decisions that were made around stereotypes, when in fact, probably Carl was probably pretty active. I know he was in the movie Up, but changing the narrative also changes how we interact with people and how they see themselves. So if they see themselves if we only see them and they only see themselves using these sterile products that are bulky, that elder design type products, I think it has a negative view about how they feel about aging and also how we'll look at about aging. So there's an opportunity to change the narrative. So it's kind of a lot. I'm still learning a lot, and I will quite clearly say I still am ageist in terms of the narratives I use and the language I use. It's an ongoing learning for me, even as I get older, which is interesting, but it's something that's a challenge. So maybe unless Surya, to answer a question, because I think we could just only go about 5 minutes here.
Right. Well, Glen, thank you for those gifts. My goodness, there's so much you've given us. If I just to here are some of the things that are going to stay with me. This insight, this prejudice against ourselves, our future selves. Oh my God, of course. But that is such an insightful way to look at it. This inevitable future for all of us, and having a prejudice against that is great. I love that. You introduced the frame of the frailty narrative, right? This notion that we're not aware of, and and a way to counter that with really differentiating chronological aging versus your felt age, right? Super important thing, because we're living older, but we're also living healthier, right? So that's fun.
I think that, so can I just, that was something that I think is really important, because we, as you kind of look up on the age ladder, and the idea that when you look at someone who's 75, and you design thinking based on that chronological age, and when they're going, when they're saying, well, I feel 55, and you wonder why they're not using your products.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So we're using some very simplistic ways of thinking, and they don't have some sophistication. That's a great sort of paradigm tool for us to think about. I know personally for me, as I watch my parents age, one of the things that always struck me is, why are these folks who through their life they've lived in well-designed environments, and then when they get to this age in their life, they're surrounded by industrial machines, right? And all their equipment suddenly it's tough. Like you said, it's purely just function, right? Even if they didn't need any of that, why did the environment progressively get uglier? Right. So, so I think you point at when you talk about exaggerated design, that's so important. I mean, such a stereotype. I do have a question for you.
Sure.
I mean, you have, so one of the things you've offered to us, which is this shift to designing for dignity, right? What is one, you already gave us some clues. You can begin that by bringing in age diversity, shifting the narrative. What might be one or two very tactical things to do next week or tomorrow to start to shift in, as for yourself as a designer, for your own design team, to make this shift to designing with dignity, or designing for dignity rather?
I mean, sometimes I've told, and I've worked with companies, and I've even talked to my students, and one of the first things I always ask them, would you use this? Is this dignified for you? And if you're designing something that you wouldn't use it, that I wouldn't use this, or this seems very undignified to use, maybe don't do it. So, and it was a company that, and it was quite interesting that they were designing something, and that was my first question. So it is this, there's a little bit of self-reflection about that we're looking at a demographic, and then we think they're radically different from who we are in our life, and they aren't. It's just part of our life. And so, I think that is, a lot of it is all about self-reflection, in any of these things about, and looking, is this a dignified response to this group? And if you're not finding it a dignified response, then that's probably a good indication at that level. The other thing is, of course, engage. And it seems to be a harder group to engage with, but that's intergenerational connections. And I would ask people, on a day-to-day basis, outside of maybe your mother or your parents or your grandparents, at over a certain age, who do you interact with? And people rarely interact with that demographic, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I imagine, as you pointed out, some of that is chicken and egg, right?
Yeah,
you don't interact, and that creates another kind of sort of stereotypical view of aging, and then it just builds on itself. So I love that as just a first step is interact with your future self.
Yeah,
right?
and be a little bit careful, because I got a lot of people that are trying to solve their grandparents' problems.
Yeah.
And just be aware of that. There's a lot of baggage around that, and that just might be your grandparents' problem.
Yeah.
It could indicate some other problems.
Yeah.
But sometimes then it falls around pity and not necessarily empathy. So I think that's where it can be a little bit dangerous sometimes too.
Can you say more about that? The difference you see between pity and empathy? What's the distinction you're making here?
Well, I think when so there's some research showing that the pity is feeling sorry for someone.
Yeah.
And a feeling, oh my goodness, you're old, you can't do this. Empathy is trying to understand what they're going through. And I think that's I think we tend to get a lot of times those confused, or it's a bit of a gray area between the two. Because I know sometimes I will get into areas of pity. So that's a short answer. I think there's a longer answer.
Right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And for me, there's a word that also comes up to mind, which is agency, giving, knowing that people have agency.
That's a good one, yeah.
And that you don't design down to.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So, well, we are at time, and I'm so grateful for all the gifts you've given us in this half hour. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience has learned a lot. So thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you.